Good evening. Tonight we are going to discuss the full moon and celebrating it as an sabbat, as a holiday that you might celebrate every month if you are Wiccan or pagan. So the full moon is the perfect time for practical magic. Sometimes this practical magic is called thaumaturgy. It's basically doing something that immediately impacts your life. And because the full moon follows the waxing moon, so the moon gets bigger, this is a good time to do things that draw something to you. Love spells are a pretty classic example, but this is also a good time for things like finding a job, for casting a spell to bring you money. This one's pretty common. And you also might want to consider if you are drawing forgiveness to you, anything that will bring something to you. This is an excellent time of month for magic of that type. So in addition to all of that, the full moon is also a good time for general healing. If you're hoping to banish a specific illness, you might be better off waiting till the new moon. So if you have the flu, getting rid of the flu is better suited to the new moon. But just being better, being healthier, is drawing health to you. So that's more for the full moon. One of the practices that is fairly common during full moon rituals is drawing down the moon. It's rarely done during the new moon. It's not that it can't be done, it's just that it rarely is. So drawing down the moon is when the high priest or high priestess or whatever ritual leader you have calls the essence of the goddess into him or herself and then speaks with the voice of the goddess. When successful, it becomes immediately apparent that the ritual leader has been pushed aside for a moment and now the goddess is in control. You are hearing the words of the goddess through the priest or priestess. It's not always successful, so sometimes even if you've done it before, even if you've been successful before, you will attempt to draw down the moon and it just doesn't work out. That's normal, it's fine. You will have to sometimes just try again next month. It's not a forever thing, it's not an every time thing. It's sometimes said that only women can draw down the moon, but that's not true at all. Men can do this just as effectively as women. Now, I'm not going to cover the process of drawing down the moon today. I may eventually do a video on it, but I'm not going to cover it today. For the purposes of this particular video, it's kind of just important to understand that it is something, if you attend a full moon ritual, you might see. You might end up witnessing this practice. If you've never been to a full moon ritual, just know that this might be a part of the group you attend with, because it is fairly common. Most groups that I know do at least attempt to draw down the moon at some point during a full moon ritual. So, the actual full moons themselves, there are 12 full moons in a year for sure. Sometimes there are 13. There are not 13 every time. Why are there not 13? It's because the lunar cycle, the time between full moon and full moon, is 29 and a half roughly days, and each month has 30 or 31 days, except for February that only has 28. So because of that kind of mismatch to those mismatched numbers, you can end up, if your full moon in January happens later in the month, you're probably only going to have 12. If your full moon in January happens early in the month, you're probably going to have 13. So it's 12 or 13. In ancient times, months themselves were calculated from full moon to full moon. They weren't a specific number of days. They weren't, this month has 31 days. It wasn't that at all. It was instead, full moon is the start of a new month, the next full moon is the start of another month. So this meant that depending on the year, there were either 12 or 13 months, which was fine as far as the ancients were concerned. They were more concerned with agricultural cycles than anything else, so it didn't really matter how many months they had. It didn't have to be standard. So the full moons themselves. These are interesting because a lot of people like to give each full moon its own name. Now, these names are going to vary widely depending on what tradition you're taking them from. So, for example, a lot of people call the moon in January the quiet moon, but a lot of people call it the cold moon. To be fair, January is both a cold and very quiet month. It's not fun if you're in the northern hemisphere, and if you're in the southern hemisphere, these names often get reversed because you experience summer when we're experiencing winter. So there's a lot of variation in the individual names. A lot of times in the northern hemisphere, these names are taken from ancient Celtic ideas, but sometimes they're also taken from medieval literature. So let's just talk about some of the names some of the moons might have. So January, a common one is to call it the quiet moon. So in the northern hemisphere at least, January is in the depths of winter. People and animals tend to be quieter, conserving their strength through those really cold winter months. Rituals for this particular moon involve things like reflection and stillness. February, it's often called the ice moon. If you live anywhere in the top 2/3 of the northern hemisphere, you'll understand why this is the ice moon. It's a very cold, nasty month. And it's also the time when the very first stirrings of life begin. So as cold and nasty as February can be for a lot of the northern hemisphere, it's also that time when nature begins to reawaken after the cold of winter. Even though we think it's too cold, this is when the first stirrings of life are returning to the earth. Rituals for the full moon in February tend to reflect the need for warmth and human contact as the winter is slowly coming to a close and we are able to go out and be around people again. March is often called the wind moon because the wind moon means the wind picks up in March as spring approaches. Rituals in March focus on renewals and rebirth. April is the growing moon because for most of us in the northern hemisphere, this is when the first green of spring actually becomes really visible. It's trying to come through in March, but in April, you finally get real spring. For most of us. Not everyone gets real spring in April. There are certainly some areas that do not. So ceremonies for this particular moon often focus on growth and expansion. May, which is the bright moon, this is the long winter has finally passed, the snow is melted, the earth is brighter and full of color, and rituals in May tend to be centered around hope and bright thoughts, because this is when we're finally out of that cold, nasty time and we can enjoy some warm, happy weather. June is the horse moon. As summer approaches its height, most mares have foaled and young horses can be seen running upon the fields. So if you live in an agricultural area, this is a good time to kind of stop and see the babies running around because they've finally grown up enough that they can be running, be enjoying their day, not just baby horses. It's often called the horse moon because horses are an integral part of farming, at least they used to be. But it can be calves, it can be any type of livestock or even just wild animals. You finally get to see the young ones. They're finally old enough now to not be confined to their dens. So that's one of the reasons it's called the horse moon. Sometimes it's called the young moon. July, the mead moon. At some point in the year, if you were an ancient European anyway, you'd have to brew up some honey sweet mead, a delicious drink that is quite alcoholic and quite delicious, quite fun to make. This often happened in July when the ingredients for mead were actually readily available. This moon focuses upon enjoying and celebrating the best parts of life, all the fun you can have, the joy of summer. August is the lightning moon because August is the month of lightning storms in a lot of the northern hemisphere. Rituals in August tend to focus on a necessary balance of nature because where there's good, there has to be bad. So you might have had a beautiful summer and now the stormy season has arrived. September is the harvest moon, and this one's usually for obvious reasons. The autumn equinox occurs in September, and this is a time of harvest. By this time, the harvest should be well underway as crops are brought in from the fields. So rituals during this moon tend to focus on reaping what you sow. October is often called the blood moon. In ancient times, this would have been when the animals would be slaughtered and processed and their meat preserved as a source of food for access during the long winter months. Winter being a much more difficult time to access food if you're not in a modern society. So back when people had to hunt for their food every day, winter was harder. And you couldn't grow your crops because there was snow on the ground. So you did tend to have to make sure your animals were slaughtered and processed and preserved so that you could survive the coming winter. Today, this is the kind of moon where you would talk about honoring the cycles of life or honoring the dead, because this is about sacrifice, about loss. November is the cold moon. This is when it really starts to get cold. In the northern hemisphere, the first true cold of the season arrives around this time. Rituals during the cold moon reflect a theme of bidding farewell to that which will soon be gone, and it can also be an acknowledgement that even though we're saying goodbye to the welcoming warmth of the earth, it will not be long before the wheel turns again and spring returns. December is the oak moon. The oak tree is sacred to many pagans. The oak appears to be dead by December's full moon, but it's merely resting. In spring, it will come to life again and embody the wheel of the year as it turns in its life cycle. The full moon is the time for contemplation, when things are quiet, when things are appearing to be quite dead, when there might not be as much to do. It's time to just think. Rituals at this time of year tend to involve reflection and meditation. And then you have the blue moon. The blue moon is that second full moon in a month. It doesn't happen every year, so not every year will have a blue moon, but about 1 in 3 roughly will. So the only reason a blue moon happens again is because of the mismatch between the number of days we have in a month and the number of days between full moons. Okay, so that's why we have that blue moon. So this means on that rare occasions, not all the time, but once every multiple months, so once every 20 odd months, you will have a blue moon. That blue moon is the perfect time to banish unwanted influences and to reflect on those things which are rare and special in our lives, the way a blue moon is rare and special to us because it doesn't occur every month. Anyway, those are the basic moons and the way you might want to change your rituals during those times of years to match the energies of those moons. There are a lot of different names for those moons. I've only given just some very basic names, and depending on what tradition you're taking the names from, you may have very different names for those particular moons. But it doesn't matter what you call them, the energies tend to be the same. Thank you for watching. Join us next time when we discuss the new moon and how it is celebrated as an sabbat. Blessed be.